So let's review this idea of a player manager. Let's put it in context and let's put it to work. And in order to do this, I'm actually going to rebuild this really quickly from the ground up. I'll put a finer point on the definition of variables as well. I did post a link to a forum post or an article that you can read about brief, kind of a high-level overview of variable data types, and I'll explain that a little bit more clearly. In order to demonstrate this again, I'm going to delete this coin, but before I do, I want to show you kind of the logical conclusion to this. If I take this coin that already has the logic built into it, so we've already built the logic in the previous presentation. If I take this coin and I Command D and I duplicate it, Command D to duplicate, and I could just have a couple instances of this coin, the idea is, the logical conclusion here is that we have multiple coins. You can see that my point value is set to 0, and as I run through and pick up these coins, it's contributing to my point value. That's kind of the where we're heading with this. Now, I'm going to select each one of these coins and delete this just to kind of remind you of the process from the ground up. I'm also going to delete the player manager. I have a cube that has a state machine on it. I can tell because it has this developer icon on it. I'm going to leave that there, and I'm going to repurpose this and use this a little bit later for something else. I'm going to go into my models folder. This is the object that had the coin, and I'll just get this into a position. Now I'm going to review really quickly building the basic mechanic for the pickup again, so I'm going to zip through this really quickly. I like to include an idle state, and this is just when the object is doing whatever it's supposed to be doing without interacting. I had my coin set to rotate, so I'm using a transform rotate. So I'm just using the search field to kind of dig through. I often remember the names of actions, and sometimes I forget what category they're in. I'm going to rotate this along its y-axis. I'll type in 90 per second every frame. And I can tweak that speed later if I need to, but of course I'll test it now and I'm pretty satisfied with that. I'll go back to the idle state. So when rotate is working fine, this is taking up a pretty big footprint. I like to use this little triangle to collapse that. I know this is working the way that I want to, and I can collapse that just to kind of ignore that action. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm looking for a trigger event. Now, there's a couple of things before I add the trigger event, or if I add the trigger event, you can see that I'm getting an error. And the reason is because this object does not have a collider. We never added the collider. That's what we did in the previous presentation way back when we looked at colliders. So I'm just going to do this now. I'm going to go to Component, Physics, and I'm going to add, in this case, I like to use a box collider because I don't have to be super precise, and that'll kind of do the trick. Now, in order to get a trigger event to work, the box collider that we've added to the coin, this box collider component, needs to be set to isTrigger. That's the only way that this event is going to be recognized. The other thing is that the collider tag, we're going to filter for things that are tagged, in this case with player, because for all the same reasons that we talked about in the previous presentation, which was my first person player has been tagged with player. I'll go back to my coin, go back to my idle state, and make sure that I'm using the player tag. And then when this trigger event happens, we want to send an event. So I don't have any event attached here. I don't have any events created. So I'm going to go to the Events tab, and I'm simply going to call this, I'll call this Pickup. And now events do not have to follow the same naming conventions as variables, so I can use capital letters, I can use spaces, I can use whatever I want here. I'm going to right click and add that new pickup as a transition. I'm going to right click and add state, and I'm going to pass that, I'm going to wire that pickup event over to state 1. So the logic here is that when we run into this trigger event, we collide with the player object, we're going to fire off a send event. I have not yet chose the send event, which is pickup. And pickup follows this wire over to state 1. Now I'm going to select state 1. In the previous presentation, we had this set to destroy self. So I'm going to type in destroy, and I'll add destroy self. The other function that this is going to contribute to is adding to points. Now, when I add to points, I want to point out, if I go into variables, remember the points variable from the beginning should be a global variable. If I click on global variable, you'll notice that I still have global points existing. Whenever I delete a game object or a state machine, I'm deleting all the local variables that exist with it. But global variables are persistent. They exist in the game unless we delete them. That's the nature of global variables. So for the sake of the demo, I'm going to go back and I'm going to delete this variable. You can see that Unity has to scan to make sure it gets rid of every instance of that and to update all of its parameters. So I currently have no global variables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to this logic here in just a moment. But we have the pickup working and we have it destroying itself, and I'll come back and add that logic here in a minute. I do want to test it to make sure that the basic mechanic works so that when I run into it, it picks it up. Now I'm going to focus on the player manager, and the player manager is going to be an empty game object. And the empty game object, I'm going to call this player manager. And on the player manager object, I'm going to right click and add a state machine. Normally, I would take the time to name the state machine, but more about that later. I'm going to go to the first state, and the first state is going to be the idle state. Now, the idle state, this is where we're going to print information to screen. And I did that in the previous presentation by going to the GUI category and printing a GUI label. We'll take a look at a better way, a more efficient way to do this later. But for now, the text that we want to print, if we wanted to print a variable, we click on this drop-down menu to choose a variable. You can see that I have no eligible variables to choose from. So I either don't have any variables on the state machine, which is the case, or I don't have any eligible variables. So let me go make one. I'm going to go to my variables tab. I'm going to create a new variable, and I'll call this simply print points. Okay, and now remember, the first letter is always lowercase, and there's no spaces and no numbers. The variable type that I want to print to screen can't be a float. Yeah, that won't print to screen. We'll convert it later. This is a string that we want to print to screen, even though it says print points. And maybe for clarification, I could say print to screen, but ultimately the data is going to contain points. I'll hit add. I'll go back to my state, and now I have the drop-down menu available where I can choose print points. Okay. I'll go back to my variable and I'll select that string variable, and just in the string field, I'm going to type in temp data, and that just is the information that's going to print to screen. So right now, if I hit the play button, you can see that I'm getting that temp data up on screen. We're going to convert that in just a moment. I'm going to go back to my state, select the idle state. So the GUI label is printing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. It's printing the value of our string data. Okay, I'm not going to reformat, or if I do, I'll do 0.1 and 0.1 just to get that off of, that data off of the edge a little bit. And this is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and it's going to do that continuously. The only other thing that I want to do is I want to convert our float value. Floats are the things that are going to keep track of our points, and the reason we want to use a float is because we can do math to a float. Now remember, when we pick up the coin, we want to add to the value of float, and we can't add to the value of string. That's like adding to the value of your first name. How do you add +1 to your name? Just can't happen. It's a different data type. Okay? So what I want to do is I'm going to type in convert in the search field, and I'm looking to convert a float to a string. And so we'll add that. And the float that we want to convert, we don't have any options available, and we'll choose that in just a minute. But the string that we want to convert to is our print points. And we want to make sure that we do that every frame. Okay, we can ignore this format field. Don't do anything with that. So we're missing the float variable. And the reason I save that for last is because we need two different state machines to talk to the points variable. We need the player manager to talk to it, and for every coin that we run into, we need that coin to be able to talk to the points data, and that's a pretty good indicator. If we have two different state machines talking to one variable, that's when we want to use a global variable. So I'm going to go to variables. It doesn't matter what state machine I have selected when I do this, because I'm going to go to global variables. And I'm going to create a new variable called points. Its variable type is going to be points, and I'll choose add. Its float value I'll set to 0. That's essentially its default value. We'll put a finer point on that a little bit later and talk a little bit more about default variable or default values. But now I can close the global variables. Now I'll go back to my state. That's inside my player manager, inside my idle state, and I'll go back to the convert float to string, and I'll make sure that my global's point float is chosen. So we're converting the value of global points to a string. This string is getting printed to screen previously. Now this loops. This is going to continuously loop. That's why we can have the conversion happen after the GUI label. But if logic determines that we have to move the convert float to string first in that list, these do run from top down. And then as long as we stay in this state, they're just going to continue to loop in this case because we have every frame checked. So if I hit the play button, we should get the value of points printing in the top left corner of our screen. Now we don't have the logic connected to where if we pick up a coin, it adds to that float value. So let's go do that now. I'm going to go to my coin. I'm going to go to state 1, which is where the object gets destroyed. And before it gets destroyed, we want to add to the float, add to the global float. And we'll do that by going into the math category. And we're looking for float add. We'll double click. And in this case, it's likely that it's going to be important that the float add happens before it destroys itself, because otherwise we could get into a situation, again, where it destroys itself before it has a chance to add to the float. So the float variable that we want to add to, we'll choose from the drop-down menu. And the value that we want to add to it in this case is 1. Of course, we could make this anything we want. We could say, well, this coin's worth 5 points. So whatever value we place in here, it's going to increase the value of points by that value. So I'll just test it before I duplicate it. So I can pick up the coin. My point value is now equal to 5, and my coin is gone. So that's exactly what I want. If I select this coin and Command D to duplicate, I can just run a few more coins out here and kind of test this logic. So I should be able to run through here and pick up several coins, and I get the math that I expected. So my point value is going up. That's kind of the core concept for the points or the player manager. Now, I could do the same thing with health, right? And I'll just do this really quickly. Let's say that this cube is something that will subtract from our current health value. Well, I already have the logic wired to this for the pickup. So we have the trigger events listening for a trigger event from player, and we have the picked up state, and it destroys itself. So we just have a few modifications to make. The first thing that we need to do is we need to be able to talk to a health value. Okay, so we're going to need a health value, and we want to print it to screen so that we can debug it now, or see the data. Now I do want to point out something. I just mentioned debugging data, and this becomes very important. If I go to a state machine, okay, so I have a player manager and I have a state machine here. Anytime I reference a variable, okay, so in the case of converting the float to a string, we have a couple of variables mentioned here. We also are printing the text label. We have print points here. Now that we're talking about variables, it's really important that down in the bottom of our state window, there's a little debug check mark here. I'm going to flip on debug. And you'll notice what happens if I turn this on and off. You can see we get some extra fields here. What this is that anytime we see a variable, underneath that variable, it's going to show us the current value of that variable. So in other words, when debug is turned on, we see we're talking to a float variable here. In this case, we're looking at global points, and the current value of global points is set to 0. The current value of string is set to temp data, or whatever we've typed in here. Because remember, if I come in here and go to print points and I just randomly mash some keys here, if I go back into my state, I don't really care what that value is to start with, because it's going to be converted immediately to the float value. But it's showing me what that data is to start with. Same thing down here. But once we run this conversion is going to take place and all these values will be equal to 0. Now that I have debug turned on, I can also go into the coin and into the state machine, or state 1, In this case, it's after it's been picked up. This is where we're doing the float add. Again, it's giving me a little bit of feedback in terms of what the data currently is set to. Now we're not running the game, okay? But when I hit the play button, now our game is running, okay? And we can still go in and select the player manager, and we can still see what the data is here, which is equivalent to over here. So if I were to walk around, and now I'm paying special attention to what's going on in my state window here, as I pick up coins, you can see that I'm getting the data feedback here. I'm debugging the data. Okay, so I'm going to leave that debug data, that debug check mark on from now on. Okay, and I'd recommend that you do the same thing. Okay, we're going to update the player manager to also include some health data. We'll do that really quickly because it's just kind of a review of what we've done for points already. The first thing I'm going to do is select my player manager, and I'm going to go into my initial state. I want to do two things. I want to print data to screen just like I've done here. So I need a GUI label, and then I also need to convert a float to string. So we're going to have points data, and we're also going to have health data. This set of actions are already working exactly the way that I want them to. Unless I want to reformat this, there's no reason for me to go back in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to collapse these so that the convert float to string and the original GUI label that are printing points, those are collapsed, and I don't have to consider those anymore. I want to print another GUI label, so I'm just going to search for label. I'll double click GUI label. I'm going to let the position default. Now this time around, I'm also going to go into variables, and I'm going to create a health string. And I'll simply just call this health string. It's a string data type. I don't really care about what the default data is because I'm going to do the same thing we did for points, which is I'm going to convert some data. I'll type in convert, and we want to convert a float, there it is, to string. The float variable type doesn't exist yet. We need to create a global health value, but the string that we want to convert it to is our health string. I'll skip format, and I'll make sure that every frame is checked. Down here in the text field, I'll click on this little button to the right. That toggles between hard value and variable. So I'll print the value of health string. It's not giving me any data because it doesn't contain any data yet. The only other thing that we're missing is a health global variable. So I'll go into global variables. It's a float data type, and I'll simply call this health or player health. I'll say add. In this case, player health, we probably don't want it to start at 0. So I'll bump that up to 100, and I'll close my global variables. Now I'll go back to the original state, and this convert float to string, we'll start with the health float, and we'll convert that to our health string. And now what we should see is when I hit the play button, we should see two values printing on screen. We have our health, which is in the top left corner. It's in the default position. And then we have our points value. Okay, so I'll just run around and I can see that I'm contributing to points. I will make some really quick changes to the GUI label that's printing health string here. And from the left side, we'll say 0.1, which is consistent with the other GUI label is being printed. And from the top down, we'll do something like, instead of 0.1, we'll do 0.08 and see how that turns out. It's a little close. I'll maybe do 0.07, but you get what I'm going for here. I'm just going to kind of stack these two variables right on top of each other, and I'll make a mental note that the top value is health. I could actually print another label here to give me some output for that, but I get the idea. The top label is health, the bottom label is points. Okay, now I'm going to take this cube, and I'm basically going to do the exact opposite of what I did for points. Instead of adding, or for the coins, instead of adding to the value of points, I'm going to subtract from the value of health. So I've selected my cube that I used as a prototype earlier on, and in the picked up state, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into math, and I have a lot of different options. I could do a float add, or I could do a float subtract. And I'm essentially doing, adding and subtracting can be very similar to each other. What I could do is I could do a float add, and I'll add to global health, but instead of adding a positive value, if I want this to subtract from health, I can add a negative value. Okay, so I'm adding a negative value, so this should reduce my health. Okay, so I'll say play. Now you might scratch your head and say, well, why didn't you do a health subtract? So I just picked up the cube and you can see my health value went down. You can use a health subtract action if it makes more sense. And in fact, the logic might be that it makes more sense. So I can go float subtract, and I can use float subtract and just subtract from health. But if I use a float add, I can add a negative. I can do the same thing. Okay. And it might be that I want to have some kind of health pickup. So maybe I have a health kit that's inside my scene that contributes to a positive value. So I'm just going to use float add, and depending on the kind of object that it is, like maybe this is an obstacle, or maybe it's some lava or something that I don't want to run into, we can subtract health. But if it's something that's good that I want to pick up, maybe I'll change this to a positive value. And I'll hit play. Okay, so now I have two values that are being tracked. Okay, and depending on how much that stuff I pick up, these values are changing. So that's the core concept of variables, the core concept of making dynamic data that we can pick up. Now, I'm going to stop there with the presentations for this project. We'll push this forward in the next project and make some conditions so that if our health goes below 0, we're dead and we have to restart and replay. Or if our points get past a certain threshold, maybe we're victorious or we unlock a few things. But we're going to save that for the next project. For this project, let's wrap it up by focusing on the design of your island and experiment with things that could either contribute to your health or subtract from your health, and pick up objects that will contribute to points. In the next project, we're going to build a marble project or a rollerball project, and we're really going to focus on the concept of mechanics and playability. But that's in the next project. So for this project, we'll wrap up just by implementing these concepts, wrap our head around variables, and if you have any questions, you can post those in the discussion board. So have fun with it, and I look forward to seeing the projects that you come up with.